Good morning. Today, my name is Daniel Chu. I'm the run as Vice President of Systems Engineering for ExtraHop in Asia Pacific. ExtraHop does network detection and response. We provide a solution to do network detection anomaly and an incident response for enterprises. Well, with that said, today's topic is about owning your cybersecurity mid-game strategy. What does that even mean? That's why we're here, and let's begin. So let's talk about the most pesky type of attack out there, and that's ransomware. If we rewind the clock 6 years ago and we look at some of the attack strategies, the average ransom paid for a ransomware attack, we saw that it was a very unfocused type of attack. It was a spray and pray. The initial access was typically phishing with some stolen credentials at points in time. And the overall average ransom paid was a little bit north of $1,000 US. If we progress 2 years from that to 2018, we're seeing the attack strategy get a little bit more focused. There's more spear phishing attacks, and the type of initial access, the whole attack surface has also increased as well with bring your own device, trusted relationships, abusing misconfigurations as well. The average ransomware being paid went up by over 6 times to around 6,700 USD. And if we go to today, it's actually last year, fast forward to now in modern times, we're definitely seeing that ransomware has become a very savvy and a very viable business model. And a lot of cybersecurity organizations, bad actors, nation states, have also started to leverage ransomware as a form of business. They're a lot more sophisticated. The way they do attacks have also been more advanced in terms of their tactics and techniques and procedures. And we're definitely seeing people do more of a land and pivot, and they're trying to extort as much as possible. Not just a ransomware, extortion that they will leak data on the network, and also potentially even cause damage as well. And again, the initial access attack surface has increased, and it has also, the pandemic has allowed for different types of attacks, such as remote desktop, protocol breaches, and initial access brokers. We saw a 25x jump in the average ransom being paid to now 170K USD. And the way to visualize that is the graph over here, where you can kind of see on the left-hand side the huge exponential jump in ransom being paid. But the ransom being paid is just one element of the overall cost. In fact, we're seeing on average around 10% of the overall cost. The total on average overall cost of the ransomware attack and breach is around 1.85 million USD. And that's obviously taking into consideration not just the ransom being paid, but legal fees, loss of business, productivity, loss of reputation, etc. So that's the world we live in. That's the pesky ransomware. And we use ransomware as an example today, but at the end of the day, it's the final payload. Is it a data exfiltration? Is it a ransomware attack? Is it an extortion, or is it an impact where you're actually deleting files? That's the latter stages of an attack. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and show 3 people on the screen. And this is where I try to keep things a little more interactive. Does anyone know who these people are or what they have in common? And you can shout it out if you know. And if there's any clues, here are their names. So there's Eugene Torre, the very talented late Ariane Keoli, as well as in recent times, Wesley So. Does these local Filipinos ring any bells? Shout it out. Oh, Grandmasters. What is a Grandmaster? So in the International Chess Federation, the highest rank you can attain is a GM or a Grandmaster. So these people are excellent chess players. So why are we talking about chess? And Eugene Torre happens to be the first Asian Grandmaster in the world. And just a fun fact, I think outside of China, the most number of grandmasters in East Asia is actually the Philippines. So proportionally, I think there's a lot of people in this room that have a propensity to be very good chess players, which fits today's cybersecurity conversation. All right, so why do we talk about chess? But if you think about chess or any sort of strategy games, so for the younger people in the room, you might have played StarCraft or something new that I'm not familiar with. Chess can oftentimes be broken down into 3 main stages of the game. There's the opening, and that's where there's some rote memorization of the play, how you develop the game, And it's a lot of memorization. Most of the top players can memorize up to 25, 30 moves and all the different permutations along the way. And then there's the mid-game. And the mid-game is actually what differentiates the strong players from the strongest players, because that's where tactics are involved, that's where the long-term play is thinking, and that's where actually the final decision oftentimes is being made, at the mid-game. Once you progress beyond the mid-game, that's where we get to the end game. Now, there are cases where the end game, the top players can really change the outcome, but normally at your end game, you have a lot less pieces, and the outcome typically is already determined. Okay? So why do we talk about chess here today in a cybersecurity conference? Because if you equate the opening, the mid-game, and the end game to cybersecurity, things start to make a lot more sense. And the strategy we use to defend ourselves also changes as well. So if you think about the opening, in the cybersecurity, it's the initial access. It's the ability for you as a bad actor to compromise the environment. And we now live in a world that we all know it's not if you'll be breached, but when. And when it inevitably happens, what type of mechanisms, what type of resilience do you have as an organization to be able to detect and respond to that? The initial access, we've lived in a world of protect and prevent. We want to prevent the initial access, and that's still very viable, and we should need to do that. In practical terms, that's your endpoint, that's your firewall, that's your IPSs, those ways to do initial protect and prevent. And you can see there's different types of avenues or tactics that we can use to get initial access. But we live in a world that it's inevitable, and so we can't just live and die by initial access or the opening game. It's predictable, everyone understands it will happen. And so that's why we need to focus on the mid-game. The mid-game is the area, if you look at the cyber kill chain, whether it's ransomware or some other form of exfiltration at the end of the day, the mid-game provides a lot of different tactics that a bad actor will need to progress through in order to achieve the final motive. Just because a contractor's laptop got compromised does not mean your database files or your sensitive file shares have been exfiltrated. There has to be a natural progression. It's like a paratrooper who gets launched into enemy territory. It's bad, but it's not the end of the world yet, right? And so the mid-game, if you look below, there's very small text. It's an eye chart for some. But you can see there's different types of tactics, techniques, and procedures in the mid-game, whether it's a lateral movement, a privileged escalation, doing a reconnaissance scan, what we call discovery. These are the different steps and logical procedures that a bad actor would take in the mid-game. And just like in chess, the mid-game becomes super, super critical, because this is where you determine your fate. You will have inevitably a compromise, and how fast you can react and how resilient your organization you are to detect and respond is key. And then we come to the final end game. And that can be an extortion, it can be a data exfiltration, it can be setting up a command and control, it can be deleting files if they want to maximize damage. At the end of the day, it's the natural progression of an attack. And at that point in time, oftentimes the damage is already done. And typically, if you're doing a detection at this stage, you're just trying to salvage the different pieces. And so just like in chess, the end game, oftentimes the game has already been decided, and it's oftentimes you gradually lean to one direction, and then the outcome of the game is determined. So with that said, let's use a practical example of that, where we talk about, for those in the security operations side, the defender's dilemma. And what is that? It's what I just mentioned. Intrusions are inevitable. It will happen. And when it does happen, the defenders kind of have to be right 100% of the time, right? And then the hackers, the bad actors, just have to be right once to get access. That's the defender's dilemma, and that's kind of the issue we've faced throughout the years. When you kind of shift your mindset to look at the mid-game, in the middle of the game, where the tactics and strategy is the most pronounced, you can kind of flip it on its head and talk about it in terms of the intruder's dilemma. Because that means you as the defender, as a security practitioner, you only need to detect one of the intruder's steps, right? If the attack goes from an initial access at A and ends at a final exfiltration or ransomware at Z, there's the B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and maybe you can just need to detect B, D, and F. That's enough for you to know that something suspicious is happening, And that's where the mid-game is a great opportunity to detect and respond prior to the end game. All right, so let's put this into practical usage here. And let's look at the last 2 years, just the Conti ransomware, incident response. I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can get a sense of, in practical sense, why the mid-game is so important. Day 0 is the initial access. We mentioned it's inevitable. We'll do our best with firewalls, IPSs, other endpoints to be able to protect and prevent. But inevitably, someone will plug in the wrong USB drive, open up the wrong email attachment, click on the wrong link, and there's initial access. Once initial access occurs, you can see that from day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, up to the early half of day 5, these are all opportunities to detect and respond in the mid-game on the cyber kill chain. And yes, ultimately, if things were too late and things were not detected in time, by the latter half of day 5, we see encryption starting and ransomware attacks happen. A lot of organizations, a lot of approaches have been, let's beef down on day 0, and let's beef down on the latter half of day 5, where we can backup restore, or we look at stuff from the storage perspective. However, you can see that there's a lot of opportunities in terms of the defender's dilemma, now to the intruder's dilemma, and opportunities to detect and respond in the mid-game. And so, how do we make sense of that? That's great, that's very theoretical. Let's put this into practice. If you look at the Security Operations Center, there's kind of, Gartner calls it the SOC visibility triad, and there's kind of 3 sources of data that's available. There's endpoint agent data, like EDR solutions, antivirus solutions. There's logging with solutions like SIEM or SIM. And the third source of data is network data, all right? And so I use an analogy to hopefully make this easier so someone can understand the trade-offs that you get when you're discussing mid-game and the type of data you're collecting and how that's helpful for detection and response in the mid-game. So let's take, for example, this GPS view of many houses. It's a clear visualization of all the houses, all your servers and assets and IoT devices, as well as all the interactions going in and out of the house. You can equate that to network detection and response. On the network, you see you're an unbiased observer of all the interactions, and you are able to get very clear visibility of all the interactions. So for the mid-game, this is a great level of visibility, right? You see all the interactions going on between the houses, who's going in and out of the houses, what are they doing, and how many houses are there in the first place, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, right? How many servers and clients and PaaS infrastructure you have. But the network is not perfect. What does it show? It doesn't show what's happening inside the house. And that's where endpoints, you can kind of show the analogy here, provides information on the host level, on the operating system level. It shows you files, processes, registries, and it gives you a very high resolution view of what's happening within the host itself. It would be beautiful if we lived in a world where we just install a bunch of agents and call it a day. But in reality, we do know that we can't install endpoints on everywhere, right? Let's take IoT devices, IP cameras, IP phones, printers, smart boards. These are all devices you can't necessarily just install an agent on. Or take, for example, cloud, where a lot of our organizations are moving to cloud. If you have a platform as a service, let's say AWS Lambda functions, it's not somewhere you can just install an agent, right? So there are gaps. It helps fill a lot of these gaps with endpoints. There might be servers, legacy systems in a lot of banking environments where you can't install an endpoints, and that might be a gap that you should be aware of. Although the ones you do install, you get very granular details of what's happening. And lastly, we have logging. And I like to think of logging as very precise. You're looking at a specific application log, such as a Microsoft IIS web server log, Apache Tomcat web server log. It gets you visibility into a specific application. Or it could be something like a firewall log or a NetFlow log. And that will give you visibility typically of all the interactions going in and out of my community, like the security gate on the bottom right-hand corner. So you get a good view of what's going in and out, but you may not necessarily have the visibility of the interactions in the mid-game. Server-to-server traffic, user-to-server traffic, because that's also some of the things you need to think about. So when you think about your security operations center, it's not good enough to think about, I have a SIM solution, or I have EDR. Where is my SOC? Where is my logging coming from? Because my detection and response in the mid-game is predicated as to where I'm collecting data on the endpoint side, on the network side, as well as on the logging side. And the networking side, you might also need to understand how much of my traffic is encrypted. Does my solution have the ability to decrypt the traffic? Am I able to scale out? Because right now, I'm not looking at just perimeter network traffic now. I need to look at east-west network traffic. Is my solution able to scale so I can monitor not just users going outbound to the internet, or am I able to see server-to-server interactions? So that's really important as well. So again, let's make it more practical and talk about an actual breach. And so last year, there was a high-profile breach in America. It's an oil pipeline company called Colonial Pipeline. Unfortunately, they were a target of an attack by a suspected Russian organization called DarkSide. And what we did see is they were an organization that actually had quite a lot of different solutions out there, mostly a lot for initial access prevention, right? They had your next-gen firewalls, your CASBs, your EDRs, your SIEMs. I probably named every single acronym out there, right? And so you have all this investment, and that's great, and it should be there for protecting and preventing. But what are you doing in the mid-game to help provide more resilience? And so, not to toot our own horn at ExtraHop, but this is a clear case study where we do have customers at ExtraHop who are monitoring the mid-game, and they were targeted by the same organization, DarkSide. Now, you can argue whether they spent the same amount of effort for each victim, but the story remains is we did see a suspicious file share activity east-west between servers and clients. And so, yes, some damage was done. However, as an organization, cybersecurity organization, we were resilient enough to be able to stop the attack and detect them in the mid-game. And so that's the tale of two cities, the tale of two stories in terms of understanding breach versus no breach, right? You will have compromises. Does it become a full-scale breach? Oftentimes it's predicated on whether you have a great mid-game strategy. All right, so wrapping things up, what's the take-home message from today's conversation? First, protect and prevent is viable, and we still need to do that. But for initial access, it's not sufficient. It's not about if you will be breached, it's when. And when it does happen, does your organization have the resiliency? One of your users will do something silly, and inevitably a breach will occur. How do we prevent it from becoming a full-scale data loss or full-scale ransomware attack? It's focusing on the mid-game. And the mid-game strategy is adding resiliency, because when you focus on the mid-game and you look at the data you're collecting either with the network, via logs, or endpoints, and you revisit where your strengths are, where your gaps are, you can understand and have the opportunity to detect and respond and stop an attack while it's progressing to the final stage of the end game. And so that's very important to understand when you're looking at your sources. Don't just focus on the technologies you use, but where the data is being collected, where are your strengths, where's your weaknesses, and that will help out. And I'll leave with the final saying here. Once inside, the intruder is foreign to the environment. Like I mentioned, it's like a paratrooper landing in enemy territory. The defender needs only to detect one of the intruder steps to start a response and prevent damage, and that's the mid-game interval. I want to thank you for today's time. Feel free to stop by the booth that we have there. ExtraHop is a network detection and response solution. So we help a lot of enterprises, both small and big, on-premise and cloud, provide the ability to do real-time detection and response. And happy to talk through more stories around that. Thanks a lot, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Sorry.